You are Norman Finkelstein, the poet, not the other Norman Finkelstein. There are two of them out there. It's
This is true.
um, I discovered that when I mentioned you recently on my Substack that there was some question which which it was I was talking about, and so it's good to
Well,
clear
that's a
that.
good sign because ordinarily people assume that I'm the other one and that's that.
Well, poets are a more obscure breed in general in public consciousness, but I've got a literate readership. I like to think. I like to think that's what draws them to my Substack. Anyway, you are Norman Finkelstein, poet, essayist, critic, and I wanted to talk today about a number of things. But first, I did this is something a sort of ritual I go through whenever I talk to any other writer is I hunt out which volumes of his or hers I happen to have. And I discovered I still have my copy of Track, which is a poem
Wow.
sequence that's one of your older works, I'll admit. I have others around too, I think. I'm just horribly disorganized. And I have your most recent book on literary essays that you sent me.
Right.
In fact, you sent me three volumes of those as well. But the thing I principally want to talk about today probably is your recent. As I say, I think of it as a trilogy, but apparently it's not finished. It's still going on. Um, Sorry, try not to get the light reflected on it. From the files of the Imminent Foundation, in a broken star. There is something. Anyway, this one has a matte cover, so it should show up better.
Right.
And
Right.
Further Adventures. A very nice cover there, too. Um,
Elizabeth Murphy designs beautiful books for Dos Madres Press.
yeah,
I've
I do
never
like
been
them.
disappointed with her work.
Yeah, no, now I know her name. I'm often impressed by how attractive the Dos Madres volumes are, which is as should be. Um, and the reason I want to talk principally about that trilogy, not only because it's recent, but because it's fascinating. I want to say that it's a
Thank you.
great read. I mean, it's long poetic sequences that are how can I put it, somewhat hermetic, somewhat
Mhm.
ironic, witty, profound.
Well, they they are difficult, they are challenging.
But the
But they are
majority.
often, cutting edge in the best sense too. I mean, I would, cite Nathaniel Mackey's work. I would cite Joseph Donahue's work, Rachel Duplessis's work. These are works that are firmly within what we might call an avant-garde modernist and postmodernist tradition, but nobody's saying they're easy.
Yeah, but even if they're not easy, neither are they off-putting in any way. That is,
No.
I mean, one can enter into them and be carried along. I mean, they're wonderful successes of images, wonderful turns of phrase, wonderful conceits. There's a kind of narrative, although it's not a strict set out linear narrative, but there's a narrative continuity. I should say that you introduce the notion of the imminent foundation, which I want you to explain in one volume. We
Uh-oh.
acquire the character of Pascal Wanderlust, who's become our great protagonist, our I don't know, our Odysseus, or whatever we want to, or our Pascal. And
Both.
in the latest volume, of course, the great, the truly great Augustus Sprechenbaum.
And
Uh,
you'll be hearing from him. I'll read a bit from him.
oh, good, good. But I was wondering, and I should say also, of course, I don't. I think you got in touch with me before I ever got in touch with you, right? I mean, is that the way?
Right,
Right. Okay.
right. And
But it could have.
I wanted to be in touch with you partly because of the Gnosticism that we both share an interest in, and I think by then I had been reading Kenogaya, and our mutual friend Henry Weinfield
Yeah.
was alerting me to really the beauties of your essays. So yeah, I definitely reached out.
I fell silent then because I love anything that sounds like praise coming my way. But what I meant to say
Yeah,
was
that was praise. But
I
do
could
go
just
on.
as easily have searched you out because I'd actually discovered in part actually through Henry, but I had encountered a poem of yours already on the Piper at the Gates of Dawn of the Wind in the Willows, which I'm quite fond of that poem. And so it could just as well have gone the other way. I could have gotten in touch with you. And as you say, there's a certain interest in Gnosticism, Gnostic themes. I
Mhm.
think we both agree that the very category of Gnosticism, of course, is a lot more ambiguous than it often is in the well, in my world, in the sort of polemical discourse you encounter. I mean, Gnosticism has become a vague name for every pathology of modernity that some.
Right. And when I told my old friend Donald Ravel that we were going to have this conversation, he said, don't end up being burned at the stake, please. Um, and I said,
I
no,
take it
I
he
don't
doesn't
think
know
I have to
anything
worry
about.
about that.
Yeah, I take it he's not familiar with. Yeah, no, I have no. I mean, I think it's silly either way. The other times, of course, we also saw that there was a period when it was fashionable to adopt something called Gnosticism as some sort of part of a so I don't know, vaguely new age kind of spirit, and that's equally historically unmoored. It has very little.
Right, right. And that was not the case for my first exposure. I mean,
Yeah,
my first exposure was through Gershom Scholem and Harold Bloom.
right.
So it was much more literary
The hint of
m-
Kabbalism. Yeah,
and Kabbalism. Right,
yeah,
right.
yeah.
My interest in Kabbalism and reading Scholem and the idea that there were Gnostic influences in Kabbalism. I said, oh, what's that? So away we went.
But I mean, it's turned into a very rich vein for you to mine because I don't know. There seems to be an imaginative energy in these most recent volumes of poetry that suggests that you're just you're like an otter at play in the water. I mean, you seem to be you draw, and it's part of the sort of the joy of reading. That's something I can't emphasize enough. Modern, postmodern, cutting edge, avant-garde, call it what you like, but in no way is it an unpleasant experience for a person who just enjoys reading for the sake of reading.
Well, I would like to think that part of that pleasure comes from my turning with the Imminent Foundation volume towards narrative.
Yeah,
And there has always been a subterranean streak of narrative, even in a good deal of my lyric poetry.
yeah.
And it became increasingly explicit as I was writing that volume. Though, as I mentioned in the afterword to Further Adventures, it was also a set of linguistic experiments and voices, identifiable voices, the voices of quote unquote characters began to emerge. And then I realized, oh, this is something else. This is something different. Where can I go with this? And that was well along in the Imminent Foundation collection, where definite narrative threads, little stories within stories were coming into being, and I found that both surprising and delightful.
Well,
So, yeah.
well, I have a great appetite for narrative verse. Actually, I think it's sadly abandoned form to a large degree, and it doesn't even have to be great if it's a good story. I mean, but I mean, I'm one of those uh, people who actually just loves, I don't know, memorizing passages of William Morris.
Okay.
Because I love it. It doesn't, as I say, I mean, or yeah, Christina Rossetti, The Goblin Fair. I just love, I do in fact love narrative verse, and I do think it's a pity that there are very few. Um,
Well, I mean, the
com-
great age of that was the Victorians,
yeah,
and we can understand after a certain amount of after reading a certain amount of it, why Pound, decided to undo it. But
you can
he
always
still
understand.
loved Browning.
You can always, but I love Robert Browning, right? I mean, I
Yeah,
love The
right.
Ring in the
And
book.
so
It's
did
sort of,
he.
yeah. And so I understand both the reaction, but I give Pound credit for not being too reactionary. But you could see, for instance, why Eliot rejects against rejects the ascendancy of the romantic canon and wants to go back to the metaphysicals, and you can understand for at a particular moment why that's so. But it becomes an indurated dogma, you
And
know.
and keep in mind too that modernist turn was 100 years
Yeah,
ago
it's 100 years ago.
at this point. So, there's all sorts of water under the bridge,
Yeah,
poetically speaking. My great concern, and well, it's a concern, but it's also a wonderful challenge in regard to writing what we might call narrative verse, is to make sure that it's verse.
yeah.
Because I don't ordinarily write in lines that scan. I don't ordinarily use rhyme in a regular fashion, but I I am bringing those techniques in variously in order to basically push the music along.
Yeah.
And that's really something that I would not have dared to do, you know, 15 years ago. Or back when I was writing track, which is written in a completely different kind of
Completely
music.
different. Well, yeah, completely different. Yeah, it's um, well, I mean, every great composer has different writes different kinds of music according to the forces being employed, right? But I mean, I'll say this. Yeah, your lines may not strictly scan, and it's not, and they're not. And I mean, strictly metric, not sprung rhythm or anything. Nonetheless, there is in these three volumes, it's especially audible when you read it out loud, when you read them out loud, which is how I tend to read poetry. Uh, there is a cadence and a flow to them that no one's going to mistake for prose that has just been arbitrarily broken up into separate lines.
I can't tell you how grateful I am to hear you say
No,
that.
that's true. I mean,
No, it really means a lot, because it's an anxiety of mine.
well, I
Um,
mean, I do think that be one of the I'm not naming any names. That's invidious anyway, and it's always unfair. But I mean, there's a lot of sort of a lot of poetry that's written, which really is these days prose that just has breaks in the
mhm,
lines. So
mhm, mhm.
and
Well, a lot of poets are turning to prose, period.
yeah,
And I think that's sometimes it's necessary, but sometimes it's a bit of a cop out.
yeah.
Oh, sorry.
But as I say, I am susceptible to the form, the narrative. As a kid, I think my love of poetry was nourished pretty early on by things like Idylls of the King and
Mm.
books like that. And I've never regretted it. I don't even regret having read a lot of Longfellow as a boy. People tell you, you're supposed to disdain him. I said, well, he's a popular poet, but why not? There's a lot of lovely lines in there, a lot of very clever technical, and
And
I loved it when I
what
was a
what
child. I
what
loved
brought
Hiawatha.
me into that world wasn't narrative, but it had that kind of musicality, was Charles Gardner Versus.
Yep. Yes. Well, Robert Louis Stevenson is
Yeah.
sort of a sacred name for me. And when I was very small, it was actually, I think, my father used to occasionally recite, sing a song of seasons, something bright and all.
Hmm. Hmm.
Fires in the winter. No, sorry. I've suddenly found fires in the fall. It's flowers in the springtime, fires in the fall. There was a time when I never forgot a line of verse. I know I'm getting senile
Um,
because all sorts of things are slipping away. But the point he was making then was that the word fall didn't originate in America,
right.
but anyway, but yeah, no, I loved the Child's Garden of Verses I still do actually. In fact, I just reread it last week. Curiously enough, I really shouldn't have forgotten.
Where
Um,
where go the boats, the lamplighter, those are really burned into my soul. My mother read them to me, and I still have the illustrated volume that she read to me from.
now I'm going to sink into a mire of nostalgia if it
Okay, all right.
continues. No, but but what I was saying is quite earnest. I mean, there is a music and a cadence and a flow that and in these books, and they read as poetry without being strict and scansion and all that. They're also, as I said, narratives that carry you along, not in the way that it's not. They're not purely episodic narratives. It's not like, wait, well, what happens now that Circe has a, but
Right,
still.
right. And
So
actually, I was going to address that because one of the great pleasures of writing this material, working with this material, is that when the time is right, when I intuit that the occasion is there, I can pull in all sorts of stuff, and that's, if you will, a more postmodern tendency.
yeah.
And I get to play with all sorts of things, and there's just all sorts of stuff in the playpen right now. I mean, I have my favorite toys that I return to, but it's and I and I'm talking not only about stuff from pop culture, but intellectual ideas, um, things that I may have been talking about with other poets, or with the poetry group that I have. I'm teaching my Freud class again at Xavier, so every time I do that, I steal a little bit from one or another of Freud's papers, and it's great to be able to weave that stuff together in very unlikely ways sometimes.
Uh, in very clever ways too, though. I mean, every once in a while, there are places in here where a reference may be slightly abstruse, I don't know, but where you draw connections referring to things. I can't even come up with an example just now, so I'm speaking rather
Mhm.
vaguely here. But where there's a connection, juxtaposition that struck me as especially ingenious several times actually. So um, at least the toys in the playpen are being built into, you're stacking the blocks in interesting ways. You're not just tossing them around the playpen.
Right.
Um, so this after the long. I'm going to ask you. I have to ask you to for those unfamiliar with these books to explain three things, if I may. The first is what the imminent foundation is for this sort of Rococo
Um, I mean,
creation.
I can tell you how it came to be, but that would only be anecdotal. Now, I'll quickly give you the anecdote. My wife and I were visiting her mother in Virginia Beach, and we wanted to just kind of get away for an afternoon. So we were driving around, and we came upon Edgar Casey's Institute. Edgar Casey, the psychic, from when was he doing his stuff? Like in the 30s or
30s mostly, yeah,
yeah.
or before that
And
actually.
it was an extraordinary experience for me. They had the largest library of occult and parapsychological books that I had ever seen. and you get tested, your telepathic abilities get tested, and you get to walk around
Pretty
the
sure I would
grounds.
fail. I would get a failing
Oh,
grade
I failed miserably, but that evening, I began working on a poem that was loosely based on our visit there, and that became the first poem that I wrote for the Imminent Foundation sequence. So I realized, though, very quickly, because I was also working with a lot of code switching and different kinds of voices within a single poem, I realized that this set of poems could also be a set of different speech acts or rhetorical situations. And out of that came the Imminent Foundation, which, dabbles in everything from cybernetics to alchemy to flat out magic. Um, and that's how the sequence developed. So the Imminent Foundation is imminent. It's all over. Um, if you want to get conspiratorial about it, it's part of, or it is, the deep state. It is full of intrigues and riffs and arguments amongst its different cults and subcults, but it allows me to play with what a popular sense of paranoia,
Yeah.
and that's how it came into being. Yeah.
You see, that was exactly the word I was going to use. Is it's a sort of lovely, in some ways, a lyric fantasy on fantasia on paranoid themes.
Hmm.
Um, Also, I mean, of course, there's that already connects it to a certain understanding of Gnosticism, simply that there is a kind of brilliant paranoid conceit deep within Gnostic sensibility, the notion that we are constantly being watched by powers and confined by powers and deluded by
Defined by
powers,
powers. Yeah.
yeah,
Mhm.
that don't have our interests at heart, but are part of a vast system of secrets. Well, if actually, I think on the back of the book, let me read. The foundation is a network of spies and secrets, an infinite arcanum of hierophants and fools, residing in a mansion of closets and trapdoors, stairways and hallways, nested studies surrounding a library where the scholars sleepwalk forever and the catalogers despair.
Right.
Um,
Right. And I think another influence that was very important for me was John Crowley's novel Little Big
The Egypt cycle.
and the Egypt Cycle. Very, very important.
I'm sorry, what was the one you mentioned? I spoke.
Little Big.
Oh yeah, Little Big. Well, that's probably his best book. Though at least the first volume of the Egypt cycle is.
Right, right. Yeah, I want to reread the Egypt Cycle at some point. Really, really wonderful. But I think maybe that house and that estate is, it might be the house in some respects from Little Big. Uh, but Coleridge is a tremendous influence on me, and I'm thinking about Xanadu all the time. Those kind
Yeah,
of
well, you throw
magical
the,
spaces.
well,
Hmm?
Kubla Khan
Right,
shows up more than once. So, at least I seem to remember the weave a circle round him thrice.
right, right. All that, all those places where different different realms are very close together, and the fabric of reality and irreality are such that you can pass through them. So portals and mirrors, and all that paraphernalia is crucial to it. and I seek to find the language that will enable those sorts of acts of transportation.
Yeah. I have to say, I mean, that's it. I have very much that same sort of it was a fascination, but again, with mirrors and doorways and places of transition. In fact, I know you have a copy of the manuscript for my forthcoming book. There's a story
Mm-hmm.
there called Thresholds.
Right.
Have you
Right.
read it?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
it's I thought about this last night. I thought, well, that story might be one that you would pick up on better than I would in some ways. Understand?
You better be careful. I'll start borrowing from it.
Well, everyone borrows from everything. Actually, I have
Right.
a friend, the novelist Sally Vickers, and when she read that story, she said that I had stolen it from her subconscious because she had a story in mind with many of the same images. But I mean, I think that there is something. Isn't it funny? There really is something that remains mystical and baffling in things as simple as doorways, with doors open or closed, or best of all, half open.
Half open. Right. Right.
Mirrors, places in the forest where branches bend above a path and seem to create a gate.
Yeah, I mean, and all of this imagery is so capital R romantic and so very 19th century. And I think that when I find myself using that kind of imagery or that sort of discourse, I am also in a liminal space between being straightforward and being ironic about it because
Yeah,
it has its own ironies built right in.
yeah.
So that kind of magic, um, to flat out use a term that another mutual friend of ours, Peter O'Leary, would not, back away from. That kind of magic and that kind of spell casting is something that is always attractive to me, and I think it's also keeps me connected or keeps me in between, generically speaking, the lyric and the narrative. Because there are times in the work occasionally where I'll just, break out of the storyline and write something that is tantamount to a spell or a nursery rhyme. And those are the moments that I find really
I'd also say there are
most fun.
moments in these books that I might describe the diction as oracular.
Hmm.
And just leave it at that. I wouldn't unpack the word, but I mean that's another word that you mentioned actually the line with both ironical and not. I mean that is actually though at our moment in cultural history, it's very hard. We can't approach perhaps the romantic sensibility with perfect naivete, right? I mean, it's
No,
in a sense that's a path that's somewhat closed to us,
yeah,
but with just enough irony, you can force the door open and return to it as long as you assure yourself and your readers, I suppose, that there's a certain degree of ironic distance, that you understand what you're doing, that you're not just surrendering to bathos or to
right. But
pathetic
though the best of it was never really pathetic either. I mean,
no,
and
no. I mean,
and
there's always a consciousness and a sense of the past.
and I think we're talking about it, whether we're talking about the Idylls of the King or whether we're talking about, Child Roll into the Dark Tower,
Or Don
or Don Juan. Juan, he moves all the way over
or
to
I'm
Sal.
saying move all the way over to the ironic
Mhm.
but the satiric, but at the same time somehow still manages to maintain the epic and lyric beauty of the structure, even though it's hilarious all the way through.
Yeah, and that's why I think of Pascal Wanderlust, who came out of an alembic. Actually, I just wrote a whole section about Pascal's birth, but
Oh,
and the magical acts that were required to bring Pascal into being.
Dr. Wagner have anything to do with it?
Uh, no, it's more like Dr. Faustus, rather than
Okay, well, even more interesting.
right. But where was I going with that? Uh, the irony of it is such that even before I put, pen to paper, and I'm reading about, I've been going through this book on the Jewish alchemists, and finding out all sorts of this. The first person who is seen as the originator of alchemical studies was Maria the Jewess.
Yep.
I was not aware of that, and I found that terrific. I said, oh, I'm borrowing that, that's for
Yeah.
sure. But um, Pascal,
Yes, I was going
Pas-
to say, why don't you tell everyone who Pascal
Pascal Wanderlust Pascal came into being when my wife Alice bought a pair of Doc Martens called Pascal Wanderlust, and they're flowered boots. And I decided, or Pascal came to me wearing these boots, and I realized that I had a hero, and I wanted to write about this individual because Pascal Wanderlust was an oxymoron to me. Thinking about Blaise Pascal and the whole business of um, mankind would be better off if we could sit quietly in a room. And that's one side of Pascal. And then Wanderlust, well, obviously, is all about venturing forth, on adventures and quest romances. So this contradictory entity came into being. And I began writing about this entity who is androgynous. And that also posed a syntactic challenge to me, because I don't know if you've noticed that I never use a pronoun to refer to this character.
Yeah, no, it becomes sooner or later you do notice in reading.
And that produced a tension in the syntax, because I've never been comfortable talking about a single individual using a plural pronoun. I'm very
Yeah,
old-fashioned
no,
about
no,
it.
I've never.
Totally retrograde, I admit it.
I said with
Um,
me, it's he or she is my
yeah,
go-to
yeah,
actually.
and I didn't want to refer to Pascal either as a he or a she. So I said, well, what would happen if I just don't use pronouns? And it created some really nice sentences, you
Yeah,
know, over quite a few lines. So I continue to do that. I mean, there's one episode where I decide, okay, Pascal is going to be a boy for this period of time in the lifespan. So I used he, but ordinarily no.
mm,
And it created certain rhythms that I previously could not have reached for.
of course the ideal alchemical homunculus is androgynous.
Is androgynous,
Right.
right? And comes from the conjunctio, right?
Right.
The mystical marriage, which is referred to actually all the way back in one of the first poems in Imminent Foundation too.
Right.
So that kind of alchemical play was that was yet another dimension that I was able to draw upon.
So then, we always have the final rundown. I think I said I'd mentioned. I also wanted you to explain who Augustus Sprechenbaum is. character for whom I have a special affection. Yes.
Spre Sprechenbaum, I don't know. Speaking tree, and I think maybe I was thinking about the Kabbalistic Eitz Chaim, or tree of emanations, when I
Yeah.
came up with that. Um, Augustus is, as I say somewhere, partly Dr. Freud and partly Dr. Strange. Um, so, the master of the mystic arts, and the master of psychic insights, and was Pascal's. mm, Pascal was Sprechenbaum's ward during a certain period of Pascal's youth, and Sprechenbaum served as Pascal's mentor. And I was going to write a sequence called, The Adventures of Augustus Sprechenbaum. And I said, no, that would be too much. This was during lockdown, during COVID, and I was reading for the first time Francis Yates's book on Giordano Bruno,
Right.
which I'm sure you're familiar with.
Oh,
I
yeah.
mean,
Well, Francis Yates.
and
The
and
Rosicrucian Enlightenment too is also.
right.
Uh,
So it was my, I had read Crowley's tetralogy, and I was thinking I really, really need to read this book. So it was one of the first books that I read during lockdown, and I realized, no, this is not going to be the adventures of Augustus Sprechmann. That would just be too much. This is going to be the lessons of Augustus Sprechmann, and Sprechmann appears periodically in Pascal's narrative too, but I wanted to give him a set of poems in which he speaks.
so
Should I
you're,
should I read some?
yeah, I was about to say. So is that's the volume that you were going to do some readings from, I believe.
Yeah, yeah. I'll why don't all right, I tell you what, I'll read. There's 10 in all, none of them very long at all. I'll read three of them. And all of them are in his voice. And I should say also that I dedicated this sequence to Don Ravel. It was very encouraging when I launched into it. It is always rising, even when it appears to be falling. The spirit, I mean. Agrippa speaks of three worlds, the elemental, the celestial, and the intellectual. But I remember the advice of the priestess. Augustus, she said to me, always remember that there is one great house. Decans, ogdoads, angelic orders, lists of demonic names, synods, symposia, conventions, the learned Hebrew doctors, the Greek philosophers, the Egyptian wardens of the temples, and all the stargazers and makers of images delude themselves, or catch a rare glimpse of truth only insofar as they keep this in mind. An old man sitting on a high throne or on a dragon with a hood of dark linen on his head, holding a sickle or a fish. A young Venus holding apples and flowers, dressed in white and yellow. Pretty pictures to decorate a palace or a book. Should a religious reform put more magic into the faith, or take the magic out of it? Does science oppose belief, or does belief subsume it? Some illnesses can be cured by restoring balance to the humors, but some illnesses are the result of such a balance. The body, I mean, the body politic. Not Athens, no, and not Jerusalem, Alexandria. This is number 7.
Okay.
Homesick, yes, for a place I've never seen, No, not even in dreams. The censors sees to that. An estate, or perhaps only a cottage on an estate. Often I would prescribe a rest cure, a sanatorium in a mountain valley. Sometimes they would show improvement, sometimes not. Sometimes they would return with the same complaints. Sometimes I would never see them again. This compound accounts for a great many of the changes. Alchemy, or rather its soulless equivalent. I've closed my practice. Well, except for a select few. One day there is a knock on your door. A stranger stands before you. I've come to take you back, he tells you. Is it too late? 30 seals and 30 shadows, 30 links to 30 daimons, that which is unfigurable and that which may be figured. Inside or outside, above or below, it no longer matters. But this much I still believe, there are 4 Führers which may possess us. I have seen them time and again. Poetry, religion, prophecy, and love. Through each we consort with the daimons of the planets and of the elements. Through each we may be restored. Not a homecoming, but knowledge of the way home. And here's 9, which is a little shorter. And there's a lot of Freud floating through here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. But to be of use. Reduce the world to a set of sigils. Memorize all the formulae and spells. Study the stars. Consult the oracles. I felt better chatting with the servant girl at the pension, and she certainly did. She understood that I had taken a vow. There I stood, the proper bourgeois, amiable but reserved. Would she have been shocked to learn what lay behind the disguise? But she was disguised as well. These are the appetites, and these are the means we have to contain them. These are the demons, these are the hungry ghosts. Watch how they heed my incantations. Whose words are these? And from what codices are they taken? None but my own. Do I hear the rabbis and guild masters laughing in mockery? Are they ghosts or ancestors? At a certain point, it no longer matters.
I was reading along. Well, thank you for that, actually. And that's, I'm glad you, I mean, that's a nice selection. It gives a sense of the voice of that particular part of the sequence in a very lovely way. Notice you mentioned hungry ghosts, pretas,
Mm-hmm.
petas, pritas.
Mm-hmm.
Any
Mm-hmm.
interest in Buddhism there?
I think I probably I can't speak too much about that because I don't know a whole lot about it, but I know the phrase and what it signifies. Um, that last bit about the ghosts and the ancestors, that comes from a very different tradition. Um, when I was studying psychoanalysis at the Cincinnati Psychoanalytic Institute, the great revelation to me in terms of psychoanalytic theorists was Hans Lowald.
Yeah.
And Lowell's great essay about therapeutic action, in which he speaks about the ghosts in a successful therapy, the ghosts become ancestors,
Yeah.
and that has been very, very useful to me. I mean, not only in the poetry, but it's become very useful to me in thinking about what happens in as a literary critic, thinking about what happens in other people's poetry too. And actually, the one of the essays in to go into the words is an essay on Nathaniel Mackey, where I draw upon the Lowell essay because I think that is precisely what happens, shamanistically speaking, in Nate's poems. The ghosts are always becoming ancestors there.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. There's a phrase in one of your poems, something like, forgive me, I'm butchering it now. As I said, my memory ain't what it used to be. Something like, psychogony recapitulates.
Oh, yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I mean, the play on the ontogeny recapitulates
Right.
phylogeny line, but I mean, precisely that. Of course, that's part of the early history of human religion, as the ghosts become ancestors. I would point out the ancestors become gods, supposedly, as
And right, right, right. That's the next step.
yeah.
Uh,
And
uh, which Lowell certainly was not going to take.
I was about to say, this
Yeah,
is
right, right.
as the,
That's not going to help us psychoanalytically.
he may have missed a step there, to be honest, but it all depends on how you understand the structure of human psychology, I guess. Um, there might be a point at which the ancestors should become gods, but that's a different issue.
Right, right, right. And that's not primarily that I would I would venture to say that's a religious issue rather than a psychological issue,
you
though obviously you can't extricate the two.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know where the dividing line there should be placed, because I tend to think that the religious structure, both cultural and the social, cultural, religious structure, and the structure of human consciousness, human mind, human memory, are in some sense isomorphic.
Hmm. Hmm.
That, and so what you see manifest in the history of culture shouldn't be neglected in an understanding of the structure of the mind,
No,
psychological or
not,
intellectual.
not at all. Not at all. As a matter of fact, in this Freud seminar that I'm teaching with a dear colleague of mine at Xavier, we've done this a few times now. We were speaking of what were we teaching? I had just taught the essay on the uncanny, and then we were doing Beyond the Pleasure Principle. And it became increasingly clear to us as we were talking about that text that Freud at a certain critical point, and I think this is the case with a lot of thinkers who speculate about the structures of the mind, had to turn from individual psychology and begin speaking more and more extensively about what we might call the psychology of culture. So, I mean,
Yeah,
we end the course with civilization and its discontents, and you can see the progression.
yeah. Of course, you mentioned the essay on the uncanny and Beyond the Pleasure Principle are the two texts I most admire of Freud's.
Mhm,
As you may know, that I
mhm,
have a somewhat mixed
mhm,
feeling about Freud, one or the other. But what's interesting to me about Beyond the Pleasure Principle is it's also that it has to become, I mean, it inexorably becomes a metaphysics in a sense, because there comes a point at which the sort of the drives he's speaking of almost have to be figured as sort of organic in one sense, in a way that's almost like it's written into the very structure of organic life and in some way encompassing the very urge to exist, the very urge to persist. I mean, there's some ways in which there's a kind of almost Bergsonian.
mhm.
Um,
And I think you're really putting your finger on something here, because one of the reasons that so many psychoanalytic thinkers and therapists reject the death drive is because there is a leap there in Freud that could be understood as a leap into metaphysics.
yeah,
And a lot of people just don't like that.
yeah. There are some people who like it quite a lot. I
I
mean,
like it quite a lot, I mean,
it's
but I'm not I'm not a therapist, I'm
right.
not a clinician, as I always tell the class. I mean, I work with a clinician. My colleague is a psychoanalyst when we teach the class, and he does not like that notion at all. Yeah, and we debate it, which is wonderful. Yeah, I mean, it's a wonderful kind of pedagogy.
So I take it you're a cat person.
Yes, I'm a cat person.
I know I don't I think it's wrong to compare species to one another. I love
I
dogs.
have two dogs too, and they're
Right.
raising hell at my house even
So,
as we speak.
so good. So if you're both a dog and a cat person,
Yeah.
that means you have a sane and balanced view of life, and you can be trusted with dangerous tasks, and be allowed to carry scissors. I have my doubts about anyone who dislikes either cats or dogs. I think there's just something missing in the soul there. But
Let me interrupt you for 1 second and ask you just a very personal and I hope touching question. Is Roland still with us?
he is. He is.
Oh,
He's surprisingly vigorous. In
good.
fact, he will turn 14 in about a month,
Great. Okay.
and he still can dash around the back garden. I mean, I'm preparing. I mean, I realize the that this is something we do to ourselves all the time with pets. We bring them into our lives; they become parts of us and parts of our families, and we love them. But we know that they're built on a more transient schedule.
Mm-hmm.
We're
Mm-hmm.
getting them, and so trying to prepare, but it's going to be hard because well, you've read Roland and Moonlight.
I have.
I think my affection for him comes through, but it's also the truth is, as anyone who loves animals knows, they do have distinctive personalities and eccentricities, and in some ways, the sort of wild, oniric invention of the Roland of the book does reflect certain I don't even know how, but I just feel it aspects of the eccentricities of this dog. I mean, he's just written himself into my emotions and my attention. So, but he is well. Thanks for asking. Yeah,
Oh,
he's
absolutely. Absolutely.
yeah.
Right. And
But I'm brought up the
Kitzel, who is the model of Sprechermann's cat.
right. That's what I was about to say. I bring this up because the thing that didn't come up was Spreckenbaum's cat. I think he should also, or is it he or she? I can't remember now.
Sprechermann's cat is a male.
Right. Okay. So, well, there are pronouns for the cat then.
Right. Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Um, but I just thought I should mention that was an aspect of the Spreckenbaum character that didn't come up in your description, and to me it
Right,
was very
right.
important.
And then there's that whole episode where Pascal and Sprechermann's cat go off on a Siberian adventure
Right.
as well. So, um, no, the Sprechermann's cat is a very dry, witty character.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh, I liked him. In fact, I said I'm very fond of Spreckenbaum. What I really meant was I'm fond of him because of his cat.
oh,
He's
okay.
fine too. I mean, I like him, but
Right. Right. Well, I mean, when I was thinking about Sprechenbaum and thinking, God, do I really want to model him on Freud? Well, Freud had Yoffe, who's
right.
a chow, right? I said, well, let's give him a cat. Let's give him Kitzel, or a cat similar to Kitzel, who is a Siamese. So it became it was inevitable. I mean, thinking also of like Alice in Wonderland, that Sprechermann's cat was a talking cat,
Right.
right? And a familiar or a daimon, in the Philip Pullman sense of a daimon. And then I realized, well, this is like the cat in Alice in Wonderland. This cat can fade in and out occasionally, just the right moments, he will appear, and at just the right moments he will disappear.
Of course, you've also now invoked more scripture for me. The Alice books, which in some sense actually might be the absolute lowest foundation. I mean, not lowest in an opprobrious sense. I mean, the undergirding foundation of my whole vision of reality, actually. Um, uh, the
Make
Alice
a
books.
note of
Yeah,
that.
the Alice books were there from the very beginning. it may be that the first narrative poem I ever memorized as a child was Jabberwocky, come to think of it.
Mhm.
Um, um, and uh, Oh, and so what we're on. I mean, I think I saw somewhere you mentioned that one of when in constructing your long verse cycles, that one of the poems that had significance for I can't remember it was an interview you sent me recently. Come to think of it,
Oh, okay.
a comedian, as the letters say,
As
the
the letter
Wallace
C.
Stevens poem,
Hmm.
the first of his big poems,
Right, right, right.
which
Um,
was another one that early on in life I undertook to memorize vast portions of.
that's impressive. Um,
Well,
I mean,
um,
and
I think, let me see, Nota, man is the intelligence of his soil, the sovereign ghost, as such, the Socrates of snails, musician of pears, principium and lex, sed quaeriter, is this same wig of things, this nincompated pedagogue, preceptor to the sea, Crispin at sea, created in his day, dot, dot, dot. That was that I used to this, and I actually I by the way I advocate this for all young persons. Something that your parents should encourage in them is memorizing uh, poetry. Just for some reason, because I've discovered that as my memory has deteriorated as I've aged, I can still draw on things I memorized at the age of 12.
hmm hmm
If out on a walk, I can still summon up poems that I memorized then, whereas sometimes have a hard time recalling the plot of the book I read last week.
Right, right, right. And well, I mean, I let us spare ourselves the cultural lament, but not only are parents not reading poetry to kids, they're not reading to kids,
Yeah.
period.
Well, I mean, you teach. I haven't taught in about 5 years now, but I mean, I think the truth is that it's not a matter the curmudgeonly complaints about the present. I mean, there really is a distressing decline in attention spans and the ability both to read and to write extended prose or poetry or anything else. I mean, it's
I have that problem.
yeah.
I find myself distracted all the time. I think my attention span has taken a big hit.
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, yeah, even for persons over, I mean, we think of it as a problem afflicting principally the young, but I think all of us who have these things, and they
Yeah, yeah.
become, for years, I resisted getting one, but then I found I could edit, work online on it, and it was, man. So I finally yielded, and it's true. You find yourself, you hear messages come in.
But one of the things that has saved me, and this, I mean, you can talk about material culture here, is that I have a couple of friends, one in particular, the wonderful poet and critic Mark Scroggins, who, well, he definitely suffers from commodity fetishism, and I think I can say that, and he won't be annoyed with me, but he turned me on to a wonderful kind of notebook. And I'm always looking for, really lovely notebooks.
I do.
And
That's funny. That's
ooh,
something I do
I
too. Yes.
like these.
I
These are
love it.
perfect.
Oh,
Um, and fountain pens,
yes, me too. Oh, well,
right.
here's another area I didn't realize of shared interest, shared passion. Yes, I'm a notebook and fountain pen. I do you like italic nibs on your fountain pens?
I haven't gotten that far. I'm just using like a $35 Pilot and
Oh no, no, no. You see, you got to get. I use a very fine italic nib, but then early on in life, I did a lot of calligraphy. So
okay,
uh,
okay. And my Freud colleague Carl Stukenberg has become completely obsessed with handwriting. He has returned to, the study of handwriting, and he has, dozens of fountain pens. And but of course he writes continually when he sees his patients. Mhm. And that the it's like Walter Benjamin's whole formulation about the eye, the hand, the eye and the hand
Right.
and what is it then? I guess the mind,
Mind, yeah.
right? And you're thinking as through your writing, and it becomes a very physical act. I compose my prose on the computer now.
Yeah. So do
I
I.
do
And it's
you,
funny,
but
and it's different, isn't it? I mean, the
Mhm,
prose it does acquire a somewhat different sound.
mhm. I'm still happy with the sound of it. I still think it's me, but for years now, I have not used like a legal pad, which is what I used to use. But I still write my poetry by hand and just go back and forth, and that's crucial to me. There we
Yeah,
go.
there we go. Yeah, that's how I do. Yeah. But I too the prose principally now the legal pad has just become a medium for taking notes, and the prose is done on a keyboard.
Yeah,
Oh well,
same here. Same here.
omnia mutantur et nos mutamur in illis. Um, so bigger question. I mean, we've talked about um, the sort of the aesthetic, the creative, the spiritual draw towards sort of liminal areas. I mean, I like the fact that you mentioned Little Big because what I actually like about that novel is how elusive the other presences are. I mean, there is this sort of other side of the veil that
Mhm.
shines through. There's a fairy realm there, but it's not vulgarly intrusive. You know, it's not explicit much of the time, and then suddenly there it is, and then it withdrawals again.
Mhm.
And what's strange about that book is that that's very much part of what makes it work so well is that much of the magical or the mystical is at the periphery.
Mhm.
Uh,
And at the heart of it is a family drama,
yeah,
uh, and a vision of American history that is quite dark, but
yeah.
and it's all handled with just such panache, just beautifully nuanced. Yeah.
It is also why I'm always fascinated by dreams. I have to say. I mean, I'm very susceptible to sort of like the ancient notion that and I mean, again, the psychoanalytic tradition takes us up in a very different key, but
Hmm.
sort of the ancient dream manuals always fascinated me from around the world, from China, from ancient Greece, and well, I mean, you've read Roland. I mean,
Right. Well,
it's
the oniric quality there is, which I think is handled so beautifully, and the use of moonlight, and now it comes to me, ill met by moonlight,
yeah, I know Midsummer Night's Dream.
and Roland can smell fairies. I mean, that's fabulous.
Well, Midsummer Night's Dream actually is something I read every year. That's just another. It's just a text to which I retreat regularly. I'm sure I read it at least once a year. First of all, just because I think it's still the most prodigiously uncanny feat of lyric verse in the English language. I
Mhm,
just
mhm.
what amazes me about it is it not only seems to sum up British lyric poetic tradition up to that point, but then seems already to have, the romantic poets in it and the metaphysicals of
Yeah.
that, and
It's
even modernism. And I just, to me, uh, it's you enter into a dream world in that play, in part of the incredible music and.
which is one of the reasons I'm afraid that I've never been satisfied by any of the productions I've seen.
I think that's true. I've never had one that quite captured it as perfectly as I thought it did. It might be because I have an almost platonic ideal now of what the
Mhm.
Midsummer Night's Dream. I mean, it should be, and nothing will ever satisfy it in this world.
Do,
Wait
do
for
you
the.
do you know Neil Gaiman's take on it?
Uh,
In The
not.
Sandman?
No, I don't. No, I don't.
It's really wonderful. I mean, the premise is that the Sandman, who is Dream, I mean, he's the embodiment of Dream, contracts with Shakespeare to write a play that will be performed for the fairy court.
Okay.
So
I like that.
Midsummer's so Shakespeare and his players traveled, basically into the British countryside, and the veil parts, and they realize who their audience is, and it's actually Oberon and Titania,
Yeah,
uh, and it's just lovely.
it's
It's
wonderful.
yeah. Hmm.
Reminds me of the story of Earless Otoichi, though. Of course, the biwa
Hmm.
player who doesn't realize he's playing for the well, actually the ghosts in that case of those who died at the Battle of Danora. Yeah, I don't know
Right.
if you know the Lafcadio Hearn version.
Hmm.
Quite not.
Hmm. Hmm. Yep.
Um, yeah, no, I like that. I know some Neil Gaiman. I've just never, never. The
Oh,
Sandman.
I mean, the Sandman is fun.
Yeah,
And there are actually moments when it's much more than fun. It's really um uncanny. I mean, he really captures a powerful sense of the uncanny. Um, and well, I mean, the ending to I guess it's Imminent Foundation, is it? Yeah, it's the very
yes.
ending of Imminent Foundation is stolen straight from the Sandman.
Afraid again, my memory of where. Uh, well, all right, I'll give it a try. I have um, an aversion to what they now call graphic novels in general, but
Mm-hmm.
I could give it a try. I don't
Well,
know.
I mean, there was a period in my pre-adolescence when I was really hooked on Marvel comics, and Marvel comics occasionally come into play in
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
poems I'm writing.
No, I know
Right.
others for whom that's true as well. It didn't happen to me. We just didn't have them around when I was a kid. My great but I actually, believe it or not, there was a kind of comic book I fell in love with very early, which was this huge pile of old classics illustrated.
Oh, of course, yeah,
Classic
classic
comics.
comics.
People who didn't know those in their childhood probably know. But yeah, I mean, what was wonderful about the old ones is they would do classic comics, illustrated Macbeth, in which there would just be long passages of Shakespeare
Yeah. I mean, my
in
first exposure to
speech
Moby
bubbles.
Dick was the classic comics Moby Dick.
Yeah, no, I mean there are a lot of books that I came to first through those that it discovered because they were in classic comics edition. I think I'm ashamed to say my first real introduction to the full story of the Iliad
Hmm.
was the classic comics version. That might have been 7 or 8 or something.
Right,
So,
right. Yeah. Or King of the Golden River. Isn't it
oh
written?
yeah, yeah, they
No?
did right. The Ruskin,
Ruskin. Hmm.
it's gosh, they were doing some deep cuts in those days. I have to say,
Oh yeah. I mean, I don't know, The Man in the Iron Mask, The Three Musketeers, those
yeah,
French adventure novels, um, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. But
I
that
remember
is a
that.
book that my father read to me.
Right.
Um, so I mean, I knew that one already.
Most of the books that were read to me as a child were actually read to me by my brothers because they were both significantly older than I was. But yeah, and it's probably their classic comics that I was reading, Classics Illustrated. I can't remember the exact name. Classic Illustrated Comics, Classic Comics Illustrated, whatever. But that I was reading. But yeah, yeah, no. But what really took my fancy, some of my friends were into Marvel Comics. For me, it was Arthurian legend,
Mm.
which then, yeah, that was a great obsession of mine as a boy. Uh,
Yeah, I think I went from various juvenile versions of the Arthurian legend um dir directly to the wasteland, I think.
well, that's
Yeah. I may
it's
have
where you
stopped
should be.
briefly at Idylls of the King, but I just moved right into the wasteland after.
So I should ask then, what ails thee? Um, you know, Fisher King. I know that. We could actually go on and talk about our various ailments. Actually, I think we've both had a few of late,
No, no, that's yeah.
but actually, so about this, these liminal places, these, diaphanous. Have you had any, ever had that feeling that you were encountering a kind of thin place? Is that an experience, or is it just an imaginative territory for
It's,
you?
for me, it really is, it's an imaginative territory, and it's, might be something that I have longed for, but have never really experienced. Now, what I have experienced, and I do not think of this in any way as supernatural, because I tend to psychologize, and that's my problem. Um, is a few moments when in writing poetry I have heard what Jack Spicer calls dictation. Pure moments of dictation. Where I simultaneously hear it in my head, and it seems also to be coming from some sort of an elsewhere. Um, and there are once or twice whole poems have come to me, in that way. But the thinning of the veil, or the momentary opening of a portal, um, alas, no.
Yeah,
I guess I'm still too much of a rationalist. I don't
yeah.
know.
Well, I mean, we are. I tend to think that our intentionality shapes what we can or cannot perceive around us, and I have to say that despite all that I write about fairies and thin and other things, uh, the basic habit of mind in me is to stand back and not,
But you're
not.
also a great rational debater. Especially in your religious essays. I mean, I think you value that. So.
What I hope is that, as you know, I have a friend, Ian McGilchrist. He talks about things in hemispheric theory
Mhm,
about the brain,
mhm.
which is actually quite illuminating. I mean, he's not a physiological reductionist, but he does believe, but he's also not a dualist. He doesn't have this. And he's written these big books on it. They're actually quite fascinating. And again, they're judicious. He doesn't. Well, this is the left hemisphere doing this, and the right hemisphere. Um, but he one thing where he does believe that culturally and individually there's a kind of mental intentionality that determines the mode within which we apprehend the world and where we place our emphasis. And again, as I say, the structure he uses for this is the hemispheric functions of the brain. And what I like to think is at my best, I strike a good equable balance between left and right, in that regard.
Okay.
But still, there's part of me that wants to experience and is open to the experience, and part of me that wants to be skeptical about all of it. But I will say, actually, there have been experiences where I don't think I can take a strictly psychologically reductive approach to them. I mean, but they've been very few, and I think there's a kind of irony in nature as well. That if it's going to give us a glimpse of what is behind the veil of Isis,
Hmm,
it's
hmm.
only going to do it in a very sort of flirtatious way. You know, not meretricious,
No, no.
flirtatious. Just a hint of ankle.
Okay, that's fine. Then in a certain respect, what you're saying is that nature has its or her own sense of humor, and
Yes, I
I'm
believe that. Yeah.
perfectly willing to accept that.
Um, but I've also had that experience of something coming to me in its totality and having an almost uncanny sense that it was given rather than elicited. Now, again, you can do the Julia Janes thing and really get hemispheric, but well,
No, 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 no,
I
no.
hate that though. I hate
No,
that.
I don't like that either. I mean, even though I find him very challenging to read, I mean the figure for me, and given given my orientation, is Mark Soames.
Right. Well, that's a
Who's
more judicious, more balanced.
oh yeah, very much so. But the very idea of attempting to you know ma map neurological models of the brain onto Freud or vice versa, is something that means a great deal to me. But he's still really hard. I find him really challenging.
Um, yeah, and I my one caveat, of course, whenever is that, of course, the old is always to make sure that we don't mistake correlation for causation. I mean, the old rule of thumb, but because I don't like to determine in advance what the lines of causality are. And I don't think Soames is someone you have to worry about with this too
Well,
much.
I'm actually, I mean, as far as what his project is concerned with, I'm happy with correlation. I mean,
Yeah, well, I see. So am I. The correlation is real and something we can follow. But I want to give you an example, since one very short story, the one that has been published before, that's at the beginning of the collection that's coming out of mine in
yes.
July, but that was missing a paragraph because I originally had to fit it into the magazine space in which it first appeared. And so it's only been printed missing one. Well, not even it's like half a paragraph, but it's a significant one to me. The True Helen. That was a case of something coming in a dream all at once. And
Hmm.
it's funny, it was a strangely vivid dream because usually my dreams are not the vivid sort that you might think from Roland and Moonlight, if those were dreams. I'm not
Right.
sure.
Yes.
But that was, and it might be testament to how much of my life I squander living in late antiquity, imaginatively. That I mean, these two figures, I knew exactly who they were. It was Helen of Troy, and then it
So,
became, the Tyrrhenian Helen, the Helen of Simon Magus.
mhm.
But really, I'm not saying the text came to me all at once, but just the succession of images while I was
Right.
sleeping.
That's what
Not
I was
long.
going to ask. I mean, surely not the whole of that text, but
No, but the Troy, Sparta, Egypt,
mhm.
Tyre, all of it in as a and the images I couldn't even recall now if I were to try, but I knew where I was, what I was looking at in the succession of images. But then, of course, I did have to turn it into a story. I'm not pretending that it was this pure Vatic deliverance from the gods.
Right, right.
But it was a sense. I mean, I found it was not long before waking, and I did feel this sort of strange sense of gratitude. I mean, that's the funny thing. I really felt like it was as much given as created. And
But
moments like that,
go ahead, go ahead. I'm
I'm just
sorry.
saying, moments like that are almost ineffably precious to me because they are
Hmm.
experiences that leave me unmoored, if you know,
Hmm. Hmm.
in a way that I very much like.
Right. And yeah, I mean, the same is definitely true, for me when um I've I've worked out the formulation and fulfilled it in in a poem. But I mean, it's interesting. You're talking about a short story, and we can talk about poems. I don't think you can talk about this necessarily in regard to like a novel.
Yeah, no, I think that would be very hard.
Yeah, I mean, you can get the germ of it, or you can work through a moment where, you're at a crux and you can't figure out where to go. And I remember vividly the novelist and what he called himself a recovering poet, Ross Feld,
Right.
uh, said to me years ago about writing a novel because he turned from writing poetry to writing fiction, and never really looked back. That with a longer narrative, and this is not the case with the narratives that I'm working with because they're just so crazy and haphazard. But with a novel, you're moving toward to to the top of a hill and you're not really sure where you're going. And then when you reach the top of the hill, you can see the path down.
Yeah.
And that's how he conceived of the narrative structure of his novels. And I think that that's very much the case for a lot of novelists.
The
Um,
only stories I know of novelists getting a sort of dream inspiration of that sort, what they are is generally an isolated image from which then the fuller narrative springs creative. I think the one example, supposedly, and this is I can't verify it from any of his letters or any of his interviews, but it was someone I met who knew Vladimir Nabokov in his last years in Montreux, and he said that the Lusian defense, that he had had a dream, Nabokov had had a dream of a figure plummeting towards a chessboard. That was
mhm.
the which is I guess I'm giving it away now as sort of like the final image in the novel. Uh, uh, and of course, he very much took seriously dreams, and he believed we were surrounded by the presences of spiritual beings. He's a weird combination of sort of Russian Silver Age mysticism and hard-headed um, modern impatience
Yeah, right, right, right.
um, but yeah, I don't think, yeah, but a poem, a short story. I mean, you can have these these flashes where you receive it whole. Now that again, I don't think even one has to draw a hard and fast division between the notion of it, being at once something unconscious in the Freudian sense, or even in the Jungian sense, and also something from beyond oneself. Because I do tend to think that the psychological ego is a fairly thin distillate of much deeper reality to the structure of mind. And I don't think that structure in its foundations or in its heights is simply locally resident in me, or you or anyone.
There was a period years ago when I was trying to figure out the nature of inspiration, poetic inspiration. And, I was moving from Yeats to Jack Spicer, to Freud on daydreaming and, some of his other, as far as I'm concerned, fairly inadequate essays on poetic composition.
Yeah, that's what
Um,
that's not the
yeah,
best.
right. That's not the best. But at a certain point, I just said, well, you know what? You can mess around with these ideas, and I wrote a couple of essays about it, and in the end I said, just do your work, take it as it comes, and listen. You just have you absolutely have to listen. You have to be able to make a space for yourself where you can patiently listen, and and then it comes to you.
Yeah.
Or hopefully. I mean, it's because those are the only circumstances that I um, can accept for the writing of my poetry. I mean, I just
More, moreover, if there is a muse,
Mhm,
she might
mhm.
become impatient with someone trying to explain her away, and
Right.
then just
And
take her leave. So I say, don't risk it.
no, no,
Just listen.
I no longer risk it, and I guess my muse and I are, for the most part, getting along okay.
Well, I mean, yeah,
No complaints.
you seem to be going through a fairly rich period of creativity. I'm glad that you're continuing this sequence. I mean, trilogies are nice.
Hmm. Yeah.
There's a kind of archetypal threeness, and that we so, but I'm enjoying them, so I'm quite happy to learn
Well,
there's more on the way.
track turned out to be a trilogy. Um, and well, I mean, I've told this story before, but I was taking a walk with Nathaniel Mackey, and I told him how I had envisioned the ending of it, and he was just kind of like, how are you going to do that? You know, I said, well, I just kind of see the ending. He was just like, oh man. Uh, and um, whereas, I mean, again with Nate, I mean, whose work is extending, you know, really, I mean, it's like Whitman, it's contoured to the shape of a life. You know, I mean, he has said to a number of us, he's definitely said this to Joe Donahue, and he's very close to Joe. He said, "Man, you got a thing. You know, you don't let it go. You got a thing. You know, so I'm not gonna apparently, or I'm not letting go of it, or it's not letting go of me, and
Right.
that's how it's got to be."
I mean, it's not like you're the Rolling Stones hanging on long past the period when you should have dissolved. I mean, you've still got the, you know, some albums there in you, I'm sure. You know,
Okay.
the truth is also, I mean, there are things that when they want to be worked out in you, they have to be worked out. If you don't,
Yeah.
you can't recapture them. I think I
Right.
honestly
Right.
believe it. I
And
find that's like, you know, I don't know about you if you've had this experience. I go back to something of my own after some years, and I like it better than I expected. But I also have this kind of, I get this sort of anxiety. It's like I don't think I could do that now. Am I losing it? You know, is my
You know
mind
what? You might not be able to do that, but you're
like?
probably going to be able to do something else, you know, and
But then, of course,
that'll just satisfy
but what I realize is of course that that piece of work wanted to be worked out, and once it's done, the impulse has reached its terminus. No, of
you.
course I couldn't do it again because I already now I know what it is, and I'd be planning it to a degree. There would be such an you know an attempt at consciously designing it in advance rather than allowing there to be a play between
And that
structure and
that
flow.
frequently proves disastrous.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So if you've got a thing, as he says, you know, play it out.
Yeah. Right.
Um, so the other thing I wanted to ask you is
Yeah.
because we've been at this for a bit, so I don't want to keep you to the point where you become fatigued from hunger or thirst or anything. But what is? I mean, can I just ask more broadly? I mean, as I said, there are these Gnostic themes, Gnostical themes. I mean, do you have any broader views of why there is this kind of? I mean, I've noticed a sort of recurrent, perennial fascination in my lifetime in recent years with nothing else the pathos of Gnosticism. You see it in cinema, especially science fiction cinema.
Yeah. Right.
The Matrix films are obvious, but I'm thinking like the Truman Show or Gattaca or um, but others as well. I mean, other science. This is a running theme in science fiction of being contained within a false reality,
Hmm.
presided over by guardian archons who want you to remain deceived.
Hmm.
Um, I'm just wondering two things: what interests you? I mean, whether Gnostic themes interest you, or as more than a collection of interesting motifs, sure, and why perhaps, at least at this moment, they seem to exercise, or at least they seem to recur with so much in at the edges of a culture that otherwise couldn't be less Gnostic in its, you know, at least a consumer culture and its contented dwelling within a realm of material fixations.
Well, I think what you just said is accurate, but there is also what we might call the commodification um, of Gnostic dissatisfaction as well.
Yeah,
I mean, you know, both the satisfaction and the dissatisfaction, thinking of a kind of Gnostic dissatisfaction, are both equally commodified, or can both be equally commodified. And
Well,
that's
I think capitalism has the power to commodify everything. I
right.
mean,
That's the power of capitalism.
every time someone buys a $25 T-shirt with the image of Che Guevara on it, I think we realize that capitalism can commodify even dissent from capitalism.
Right, and we learned this long ago. I mean, certainly we learned it in the 60s. That having been said, I think that I mean, for for me, and let me make this as clear as I can possibly make it. The Gnosticism that fascinates me, arises out of um certain currents that I also feel strongly about within Judaism.
Right.
So the I have a strong feeling, and I'm not going to be my own critic about this, but I have a strong feeling that, one could go back and look at my most Jewish poems and see in them certain Gnostic themes as well. And I'll leave it at that. Now, there are moments when it seems like, the idea of a fallen world in which we are caught within a benighted worldview, and that kind of Gnostic notion, um, is very powerful, and not just for me, as you recognize. But I also think at times, well, Norman, look, you're not really a Gnostic. Um, I mean, you're attracted to these kinds of fantasies in the same way that so many of us are. But there is a kind of fullness and deep satisfaction about creation
Yep.
that works against your Gnosticism too. Um, Now, maybe we can just call that, the fact that, it's a kind of normative Jewish perspective,
Yep.
at least from my youth and, from my background.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I too am not a Gnostic, but the thing is, well, of course, I approach it from a variety of different angles. One is that just of the scholarly uh, misrepresentation of the early centuries of the Christian era, just in general, intellectual Christian Jewish and pagan, Greco-Roman, is that is that the reconstruction of the past created pictures of lines of division that didn't exist in the ancient world,
Mhm.
and that became a sort of religious ideological project or ex-religious. I mean, in the 18th century in Germany, there are figures like Bauer and Neander who created, in a sense, created the very concept and category of Gnosticism as it would later be absorbed into a lot of scholarship in subsequent centuries in order to assimilate it to German idealism,
That's right. Yeah.
which I think is a huge category error. I think
It could be, and more hard scholarship and historical research is going and an examination of ancient texts. All of that is going to be required in order for us to have a better, a better grasp on these things. But um, you know, as fascinating as I find this to be, and this is the case also with occult systems, with my appropriations of alchemy, um, tarot, you know, not so much astrology, but various other systematizings. For me, their greatest value, and this is obvious, is that they lend so much rich material to me to make poetry out of.
Yeah. No, I mean,
And
I
okay,
understand.
does that make me an aesthete? Okay, guilty as charged. I'll take
Well,
it.
sure, fine. Yeah, so what I was going to say is that precisely, not precisely that, but I mean that. I also, I also, I'm fascinated by the pathos of Gnosticism. My own leanings are more romantic, Judeo-Christian, but also romantic and classical and pagan too. I very much. Uh, I can't feel that kind of alienation from the natural world. But I do. But what I find uh, fascinating about as I say, the pathos of Gnosticism, that sense of dwelling in a false reality, a fabricated reality, also corresponds to real experience in a different sense. Because I do think we're our hypertrophied primate
Mhm, mhm.
lives. Nonetheless, we do dwell within worlds of intentional and attentional, to use a
Mhm.
dead term from the 15th century, construction, and we are susceptible to be finding ourselves uh, immured in false realities. Just look at the way the internet culture
Right,
what it is created. With the sort of political, social, cultural disintegration we're going through, it's precisely
right, and the
to a large degree,
substitution for a false reality
yeah,
for that. But at, at the beginning of our conversation, you asked me, what exactly the immanent foundation is. And I think you're actually putting your finger on it now. That it has to do with the vacillation between illusion and the illusion that Gnosticism is related to,
yeah.
and the sense that there is, or that we can penetrate to, um, a truer sense of reality. Which I think is, of course, you've represented that amazingly at the end of Kanagaya too. Uh,
Well, thank you for the amazingly too.
yeah, I mean, just like the ending of that novel is just blew me away. It's like,
It blew me away too.
yeah.
I greatly admire the. Yeah, no. This is the point where we're supposed to dissolve in reciprocal raptures of
Right.
admiration of
Which is a perfect way to bring it to an end, if you'd like.
Well, as I say, I don't want to exhaust you. I probably shouldn't exhaust. I have a bad habit of setting these things for 90 minutes and then just sort of getting off along the bypaths and the byways and ending up keeping people for 2 hours. And I have
That's
vowed to
fine.
try not to go too far. But I will say, I will ask you, if you can share any. The one other topic we thought about just talking about a little bit before parting is of course you run or you.
Oh, the blog.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you're doing
Yeah.
your part to restore.
Well,
res-
people happily, um they have received it, and it has its niche. And
we should say what it is,
it is Restless Messengers,
right?
which is a blog devoted to reviews of contemporary poetry.
Right.
Occasionally books on poetics, occasionally translations, but mainly new or newish books of poetry coming out. I write some of the reviews. At the beginning, I wrote all of the reviews, but I'm not doing that anymore.
Yeah. Well,
And I have a group of willing volunteers who come forward and offer reviews as well. Um, Poetry and Review, all one word, .com. Um, and it was a project that I started shortly after I retired, and that coincided with COVID. And I had always wanted to do more reviewing because it was a way of writing seriously about poetry outside of an academic discourse, which I pretty much jettisoned, given up on. Enough is enough. Um, and it has worked out, and I've tried to review a variety of different kinds of poetry,
Yeah.
but I have my predilections. Um, and editing it, you know, occasionally is a chore, but for the most part, it really has given me a whole other dimension to my literary life.
Well, I dip in from time to time, I should mention, and I've discovered a few poets I'd never heard of that I'm grateful to you for introducing me to as it happens. So, um, and uh, yeah, poetry and review, one word,
.com.
.com.
Mhm.
And any final reflections then? Any foretastes of what the next volume might have in store for us, or should we just leave that?
I think if there's going to be a next volume, it'll probably be similar to Broken Star, in that there will be other poems and sequences, but there will be Imminent Foundation / Pascal Wanderlust poems as well. But don't look for it too soon.
Sorry.
We're working away.
There's no deadline. There's no
No, there
deadline.
isn't. Right?
As I said, I'm just happy that you're continuing to to plow this field,
Yeah.
as long as
Yeah.
it's still bearing fruit or yielding grain or whatever.
Hmm. Hmm.
Okay, well, I have kept you for.
This
Go right
this has
ahead.
been wonderful.
No, it's been a delight. I've
Absolute
enjoyed it.
delight.
Yeah, and it's good to see you face to face rather than. It's still not like being in the same room over the same pot of tea or cups of coffee or whatever, but it's good to see you. And
It'll happen. I'm confident that that will happen too.
yes, yes. Um, be well. Thanks for this. This I
I'm
enjoyed this
working on it.
immensely,
Yeah.
and yeah, well, we're always working on it, and
Okay.
then we die.
Okay. Right. We will be in touch.
Okay, I'm
Okay.
going to stop the
Okay.
recording now.